I still remember the smell of fresh coffee brewing at 5:30 in the morning, when I'd arrive at Henderson's Auto Supply, long before anyone else thought about starting their day. For 8 years, I was the silent foundation that kept that place running smooth as clockwork. While others stumbled in with their breakfast burritos and energy drinks around 8, I'd already sorted the morning deliveries, checked inventory discrepancies, and prepared the daily reports that kept our small operation profitable. The trust I'd built with vendors meant we got better prices, faster deliveries, and second chances when cash flow got tight. My loyalty to that company wasn't just professional, it was personal, like tending to a family business that had given me purpose when I needed it most. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I organized parts in that familiar rhythm I'd perfected over the years. Each morning brought the same satisfaction of creating order from chaos, knowing that my meticulous attention to detail would prevent the kind of mistakes that cost small businesses their reputation. David, the owner, used to joke that I had some kind of supernatural ability to predict what parts customers would need before they even knew their trucks were breaking down. That intuition came from years of listening, learning, and genuinely caring about keeping our community's vehicles running. While others saw just another day job, I saw an opportunity to build something lasting, to prove that dedication and hard work still mattered in a world that seemed increasingly focused on shortcuts and quick fixes. The walls of that supply shop held countless memories of late nights spent reconciling accounts, of emergency runs to help stranded drivers, of building relationships with mechanics who trusted my recommendations completely. My desk was positioned right by the front counter, not because I demanded visibility, but because I genuinely wanted to be available whenever anyone needed help. Customers would specifically ask for me, knowing I'd remember their previous purchases, their vehicle histories, and exactly which parts worked best for their particular situations. This wasn't just business knowledge, it was the kind of deep understanding that only comes from years of treating every interaction as an opportunity to build lasting connections. The environment felt like home, a place where my contributions were recognized not through grand gestures, but through the steady accumulation of trust and respect. Those early morning hours became my meditation, my time to prepare not just the store, but myself for whatever challenges the day might bring. I'd walk through each aisle, checking stock levels, noting which items needed reordering, mentally cataloging the 100 small details that kept operations running smoothly. The key to the safe, the alarm codes, the vendor contact numbers, I held all the pieces that transformed a simple parts store into a reliable resource for our entire community. David often said I was the kind of employee every business owner dreams about finding, someone who cared about success as much as he did. That recognition meant everything to me, validation that my approach to work, thorough, dependable, genuinely invested, created real value in a world that often seemed to reward flash over substance. That success in small business isn't just about individual excellence. It's about building systems that can weather any storm. I developed processes that ensured nothing fell through cracks, created backup plans for supply chain disruptions, and maintained relationships that gave us competitive advantages our larger competitors couldn't match. When other auto supply stores in town struggled during economic downturns, we thrived because of the foundation I'd helped build. My dedication wasn't motivated by ambition for advancement or recognition. It came from a deep-seated belief that doing things right, treating people fairly, and maintaining unwavering standards would naturally lead to mutual prosperity. This philosophy guided every decision I made, every system I implemented, every relationship I nurtured. The learning never stopped during those years. I absorbed everything about the industry, from technical specifications to customer service psychology, from inventory management to vendor negotiation strategies. My commitment to continuous improvement meant staying after hours to research new products, attending trade shows on weekends, and reading industry publications to stay ahead of trends that might affect our business. This wasn't just professional development, it was intellectual curiosity combined with genuine passion for excellence. I believed that mastery came through consistent effort over time, That expertise was earned through countless small choices to do things properly, rather than taking shortcuts. Every challenge became an opportunity to demonstrate that sustained dedication could overcome any temporary setback. The trust David placed in me extended beyond normal employee responsibilities. I had keys to everything, access to financial records, authority to make purchasing decisions that affected thousands of dollars in inventory. This level of confidence didn't happen overnight. It was built through consistent demonstration that his interests were my interests, that protecting the business was just as important to me as it was to him. When he took vacations or handled personal emergencies, I managed everything seamlessly, ensuring customers never experienced disruption in service quality. That responsibility felt like both privilege and sacred obligation, proof that loyalty and competence still created opportunities in an increasingly uncertain world. But sometimes, the very qualities that make you invaluable can also make you invisible. And I was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, when Jessica walked through our front door with her resume and a smile that could have powered the entire store. David had mentioned wanting to hire some part-time help during our busy season, someone young who could handle the computer systems and maybe bring fresh energy to our established routines. What I didn't expect was how her presence would immediately shift the atmosphere of our small workspace, like someone had suddenly turned up the volume on everything around us. She wore trendy clothes that looked expensive, carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no, and spoke with that particular brand of enthusiasm that makes older, more experienced people feel suddenly outdated. Her laugh was infectious, filling corners of the store that had been quietly productive for years, and I found myself both welcoming the change and feeling inexplicably unsettled by it. During her first week, I made genuine efforts to show Jessica the ropes, sharing the systems I'd developed over years of trial and error. My approach had always been thorough, explaining not just how to do something, but why we did it that way, what problems these methods solved, and how each procedure connected to our broader business objectives. But Jessica seemed more interested in finding faster ways to accomplish tasks, often interrupting my explanations with suggestions about software solutions or modern approaches she'd learned in college. Her questions weren't disrespectful exactly, but they carried an undertone that suggested my methods were unnecessarily complicated, perhaps even obsolete. When I showed her our inventory tracking spreadsheets, carefully organized and cross-referenced over years of refinement, she laughed and said they looked like something from a museum. Everyone else chuckled along, and I smiled too, but something twisted uncomfortably in my stomach. The first real moment of friction came during a particularly busy afternoon when several contractors arrived simultaneously looking for specific parts for an urgent job. I was handling multiple customers, accessing my mental database of inventory locations, cross-referencing compatibility issues, and managing the complex dance of prioritizing orders based on customer relationships and payment histories. Jessica watched this process with what I initially mistook for admiration, but when the rush ended, she made a comment that stung more than I expected. She suggested that if we modernized our systems and streamlined our processes, we wouldn't need such complicated mental gymnastics to serve customers efficiently. Her tone was helpful, not malicious, but it carried an implication that my approach was unnecessarily difficult, that years of accumulated knowledge could be easily replaced by better technology and more efficient procedures. David seemed increasingly intrigued by Jessica's suggestions about modernization, and I noticed him spending more time discussing her ideas than asking for my input on operational decisions. This shift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, but I felt it like a subtle change in the store's gravitational pull. Conversations that previously included me naturally now seemed to center around Jessica's fresh perspective and innovative thinking. When vendors called with questions about orders or deliveries, David started directing them to Jessica instead of me, explaining that she was learning the business and needed the experience. These were small changes, barely noticeable to outside observers, but to someone who had been the central nervous system of this operation for 8 years, each shift felt significant. I told myself this was natural, that training someone new required redistributing some responsibilities, that the frequency of these adjustments began creating an uncomfortable pattern. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine team meeting about quarterly inventory planning. I had prepared detailed reports showing seasonal trends, vendor performance metrics, and recommendations for optimizing our purchasing strategy based on historical data and customer feedback. But when I began presenting this information, Jessica interrupted with questions that seemed designed to highlight limitations in my methodology, rather than understand the reasoning behind it. She asked about data visualization tools, automated reporting systems, and integration with modern inventory management platforms. Each question was technically valid, but the timing and tone suggested my comprehensive analysis was somehow insufficient because it wasn't packaged in the latest software format. David nodded along with her suggestions, and I watched my hours of careful preparation get overshadowed by discussions about technological solutions that could apparently replace the institutional knowledge I'd spent years developing. What hurt most wasn't Jessica's ambition or her confidence in modern methods. It was the gradual realization that my value to the organization was being questioned not because my results were inadequate, but because my processes looked outdated. The same attention to detail and systematic approach that had made me indispensable now seemed like obstacles to progress rather than foundations for success. Jessica's enthusiasm for change was infectious, and I could see David getting excited about possibilities for growth and efficiency that my more conservative approach hadn't emphasized. The frustration wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Like watching someone critique a painting you'd spent years perfecting by suggesting it needed better lighting and a more modern frame. I began to question whether my dedication to proven methods was actually holding the business back, whether my loyalty to established systems was preventing necessary evolution. The most painful moment came when Jessica suggested reorganizing our parts storage system using a color-coded approach she'd read about in a business magazine. The system I'd developed over years organized parts by frequency of use, customer demand patterns, and logical compatibility groupings, method that minimized customer wait times and reduced picking errors to virtually zero. But Jessica's system looked cleaner, more visually appealing, easier for newcomers to understand quickly. When David asked for my opinion, I explained the rationale behind our current organization, but I could see in his eyes that my explanation sounded defensive rather than educational. Jessica's approach represented innovation and fresh thinking, while mine represented resistance to change and attachment to outdated methods. That night, driving home in the silence of my aging pickup truck, I realized that expertise accumulated over time could suddenly become liability if it wasn't packaged in ways that appeared modern and forward-thinking. The apprentice was about to challenge the master, but the rules of engagement had changed completely. The first crack in my professional world appeared on a Thursday afternoon when I returned from lunch to find David and Jessica huddled over spreadsheets at his desk, their heads close together in intense conversation. What struck me wasn't just their collaboration, but the intimacy of their body language, the way she leaned into his space, how he tilted toward her voice, the shared laughter that seemed to exclude everyone else in the room. They were discussing inventory projections, work I'd normally handle, but Jessica had apparently taken initiative to create her own analysis using software I'd never seen before. When I approached to offer input based on historical trends they might have missed, David looked up with an expression I'd never seen before, not dismissive exactly, but distracted, as if my presence was interrupting something important. Jessica smiled politely, but continued explaining her methodology, and I found myself standing there awkwardly, feeling like an outsider in the business I'd helped build from the ground up. Over the following weeks, their partnership intensified in ways that made my stomach churn, with a mixture of professional jealousy and personal unease. David started scheduling private meetings with Jessica to discuss strategic initiatives and process improvements, conversations that previously would have included me as the person most familiar with our operational realities. When I asked about these meetings, David would give vague responses about exploring new directions, and leveraging fresh perspectives. Phrases that felt like corporate speak designed to exclude rather than inform. Jessica, meanwhile, began making subtle references to discussions she'd had with David about the future of the business. Insights that suggested a level of access and influence I'd never been granted despite my years of dedication. The betrayal wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was the slow erosion of trust and inclusion. Death by 1,000 small cuts that left me questioning my value and my place in an organization I'd considered family. The moment everything crystallized happened during what should have been a routine supplier meeting. I'd arranged the appointment with our main parts distributor to negotiate better terms for the upcoming quarter, a responsibility I'd handled successfully for years. But when the vendor representative arrived, David announced that Jessica would be joining us to observe and learn about our procurement processes. What I witnessed instead was Jessica taking control of the conversation, presenting analysis I'd never seen, and negotiating terms using information that could only have come from private discussions with David about our business strategy. She spoke with authority about inventory turnover rates, profit margins, and growth projections data I'd compiled over years that had apparently been shared with her without my knowledge. The vendor looked confused about who was actually in charge, and I felt the humiliating realization that Jessica wasn't observing my expertise. She was demonstrating her replacement of it. The personal dimension of their relationship became undeniable during a late evening when I returned to the store to retrieve some files I'd forgotten. Through the window, I could see David and Jessica in his office, but they weren't working. They were standing close together, her hand on his arm, both of them laughing at some private joke. There was an electricity between them that had nothing to do with business discussions or professional mentorship. When they noticed my car in the parking lot, they stepped apart quickly, that the damage was done. I'd seen something that explained all the private meetings, the preferential treatment, the gradual shift in power dynamics that had been making me feel invisible. Their connection wasn't just professional, it was personal. And that personal bond was reshaping the entire structure of our workplace in ways that left no room for someone like me. The devastating confirmation came through the most mundane of discoveries. While organizing invoices, I found hotel receipts from a recent trade show that David and Jessica had attended together, an event I'd normally accompany him to as his primary advisor on inventory and industry trends. The receipts showed adjoining rooms, shared meals, and expenses that suggested they'd spent significant time together outside of official conference activities. What hurt wasn't just the exclusion from a professional opportunity, but the realization that decisions about my career and the business I'd devoted myself to were being made in settings where I had no voice, no presence, no opportunity to advocate for the institutional knowledge I'd accumulated. They were building a future for the company that apparently didn't include me, and I was discovering this through paperwork rather than honest conversation. David's behavior toward me shifted from collaboration to polite distance, from seeking my input to merely acknowledging my presence. Conversations that used to be natural exchanges between partners became formal updates between supervisor and subordinate. He stopped asking for my opinions on major decisions, stopped involving me in strategic planning, stopped treating me as someone whose expertise and dedication had earned respect and influence. When I tried to initiate discussions about the business direction or my role in upcoming projects, he would redirect the conversation or suggest that Jessica might be better positioned to handle those responsibilities. The trust we'd built over 8 years was evaporating, not through any failure on my part, but because his attention and confidence had been redirected towards someone who represented excitement and possibility rather than reliability and proven competence. The final piece of evidence came when I accidentally intercepted a phone call between David and Jessica discussing plans for reorganizing the business structure. They were talking about streamlining operations, eliminating redundant positions, and focusing resources on growth initiatives that would require different skill sets than we currently had. Jessica's voice carried the enthusiasm of someone designing her ideal workplace, while David's responses showed the excitement of someone discovering new possibilities for his business. Neither of them mentioned me directly, but the implications were clear: the systems I'd built, the relationships I'd maintained, the expertise I'd developed were all considered obstacles to the vision they were creating together. I hung up the phone feeling like I'd overheard the planning of my own professional funeral, a ceremony where the mourners were actually celebrating the opportunity to move forward without the burden of the past. The betrayal was complete, not because of what they'd chosen, but because they'd made that choice without ever giving me the chance to adapt, to contribute, or to prove that experience and loyalty still had value in their brave new world. The official end of my career at Henderson's Auto Supply came disguised as a casual conversation on a Monday morning that started like any other. David asked me to join him in his office for what he described as a routine check-in about operational adjustments. The kind of meeting we'd had hundreds of times over the years. But something felt different about his tone. Too formal, too careful, as if he'd rehearsed the words he was about to say. Jessica wasn't there initially, but I could see her through the glass partition, organizing files with an efficiency that seemed more purposeful than usual. When David began explaining that the business needed to evolve its operational structure to meet changing market demands, I knew immediately that this wasn't a discussion about adjustments. It was a termination disguised as corporate strategy. The words felt rehearsed, lacking the authenticity of our usual direct communication, and I realized that someone else had probably helped him craft this particular speech. What made the moment particularly devastating wasn't the decision itself, but the way it was presented as inevitable business evolution rather than a personal choice. David explained that my position was being restructured to focus on more specialized functions that would better utilize the company's resources in competitive markets. He used phrases like strategic realignment and optimizing human capital, language that felt borrowed from business magazines rather than reflecting our 8-year partnership. When I asked directly what this meant for my role, he avoided eye contact and explained that Jessica would be transitioning into a new position that combined operations management with business development, essentially absorbing all my responsibilities while adding strategic functions I'd never been offered the opportunity to develop. The humiliation wasn't just losing my job. It was being told that my replacement was an improvement, that the same tasks I'd performed excellently for years would somehow be better handled by someone with a fraction of my experience. The practical details of my departure were handled with clinical efficiency. That stripped away any pretense of personal consideration. David explained that I would have 2 weeks to train Jessica on remaining operational procedures, transfer vendor relationships, and document processes that existed primarily in my institutional memory. 2 weeks to download 8 years of accumulated knowledge, relationships, and systematic understanding into someone who'd been there for less than 6 months. The timeline wasn't just unrealistic, it was insulting, suggesting that my expertise could be easily transferred like files from one computer to another. When I mentioned the complexity of vendor relationships that had taken years to develop, David assured me that Jessica's fresh approach and modern communication skills would allow her to build new partnerships more aligned with the company's future direction. Each explanation felt like a rejection not just of my work, but of the value of experience itself. Jessica's reaction when she joined the meeting revealed the extent to which my departure had been planned without my knowledge. She didn't look surprised or uncomfortable. Instead, she appeared prepared, even eager, as if this conversation was the culmination of discussions that had been happening around me for weeks. She had questions about timeline, transition procedures, and specific responsibilities that suggested detailed planning had already occurred. When David asked if she felt ready to take on the expanded role, her confidence was absolute, not the hesitancy of someone receiving unexpected opportunities, but the assurance of someone stepping into a position she'd been preparing for. The realization that my professional demise had been discussed, planned, and finalized without my participation felt like the ultimate betrayal, worse than losing the job itself. The 2 weeks that followed were a masterclass in professional humiliation, disguised as knowledge transfer. Every system I explained, Jessica questioned with suggestions for improvement. Every vendor relationship I introduced, she approached with ideas for renegotiation or replacement. Every process I'd refined over years, she viewed as an opportunity for modernization. What should have been respectful transition became systematic deconstruction of everything I'd built, with Jessica positioning herself not as my successor but as my superior, someone cleaning up outdated methods with contemporary solutions. David observed these interactions with approval that stung more than direct criticism, nodding along as Jessica demonstrated why my approaches were unnecessarily complicated and how her methods would achieve better results with less effort. I was being required to participate in the dismantling of my own professional legacy. The final insult came during my last week, when I discovered that Jessica had already moved into my desk, reorganized my filing systems, and replaced my carefully organized vendor contact database with her own digital solutions. She'd taken over my parking space, assumed my relationships with key customers, and even appropriated the coffee mug I'd used for 8 years, a small detail that somehow felt like the most personal violation of all. When I mentioned these changes to David, he explained that efficiency required Jessica to establish her own systems immediately, rather than waiting for my departure. The message was clear. I wasn't just leaving. I was being erased, my methods dismissed, my presence eliminated as quickly as possible to make room for a better future. My last day ended not with the farewell gathering or recognition ceremony that 8 years of dedicated service might normally warrant, but with a quiet exit that felt designed to minimize disruption to the new normal Jessica and David were creating. A few long-term customers asked about my departure, but Jessica was already positioned to handle their accounts with enthusiasm about improved service and modern approaches. The vendor representatives I'd worked with for years were introduced to Jessica as their new primary contact, someone who would bring fresh energy and innovative thinking to their partnerships. As I loaded my personal items into boxes that evening, I realized that my 8 years of contribution were being treated not as a foundation to build upon, but as an obstacle that had finally been removed. The trust I'd invested, the loyalty I'd demonstrated, the expertise I'd developed, all of it was being discarded as unnecessary baggage in their rush toward a more efficient future that apparently had no place for someone like me. The silence in my apartment that first morning after leaving Henderson's was deafening in ways I hadn't anticipated. For 8 years, my days had started with purpose, with the familiar ritual of arriving early to prepare for whatever challenges awaited. Now I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that tasted different somehow, staring at empty hours that stretched ahead without structure or meaning. The unemployment checks would help temporarily, but the real challenge wasn't financial, it was psychological. The complete dismantling of an identity I'd built around being essential, reliable, the person others could count on when everything else fell apart. My phone didn't ring with urgent calls from vendors or customers with emergencies. No one needed my expertise, my institutional memory, my ability to solve problems that others couldn't even identify. The silence wasn't just external. It was the absence of being needed, valued, important to anyone's daily success. The emotional aftermath hit in waves that caught me unprepared. Some mornings I'd wake up thinking I needed to get to the store early, my body clock still programmed for responsibilities that no longer existed. I'd catch myself mentally planning inventory orders or worrying about customer issues that were no longer mine to resolve. The muscle memory of 8 years doesn't disappear overnight, and each reminder of my former life felt like touching a fresh wound. Friends and family tried to be supportive, offering advice about new opportunities and fresh starts, but their well-meaning encouragement only highlighted how completely my sense of purpose had been tied to that one workplace, that one role, that one identity as someone who made things work. The learning process wasn't just about finding another job. It was about rediscovering who I was when nobody needed me to be anything. What surprised me most was how quickly the world moved on without me. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard updates about Henderson's auto supply that felt like news from a parallel universe where I'd never existed. Jessica was implementing new computer systems, redesigning the store layout, and apparently impressing customers with her energetic approach to problem solving. David was excited about increased efficiency and improved profit margins. The business I'd helped build was thriving without me, which should have been satisfying proof of strong foundations, but instead felt like confirmation that my contributions had been less essential than I believed. The frustration wasn't that they were failing, it was that they were succeeding, proving that all my careful systems and accumulated expertise could be replaced by enthusiasm and modern methods. The isolation extended beyond professional displacement into personal relationships that I hadn't realized were largely built around my work identity. Colleagues I'd considered friends gradually stopped returning calls, not out of malice, but because our primary connection had been workplace-based, and that context no longer existed. Social gatherings felt awkward when people asked about my work situation, forcing me to explain my departure in terms that didn't make me sound bitter or incompetent. I found myself avoiding community places where I might encounter customers who would ask why I'd left Henderson's, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't have a simple answer that captured the complexity of being replaced by someone younger, prettier, and more aligned with the boss's personal interests. The supermarket, the gas station, the local diner all became potential minefields of uncomfortable conversations about a situation I still didn't fully understand myself. Sleep became elusive during those first months, not from anxiety about finding work, but from the relentless replay of moments I should have seen coming. I'd lie awake analyzing conversations, rethinking my responses to Jessica's suggestions, wondering if I could have adapted differently to preserve my position. The mental review wasn't productive, but it was compulsive, like picking at a scab that never quite healed. I questioned every assumption I'd made about loyalty, competence, and professional security. Had I been naive to believe that doing good work and maintaining integrity would protect me from arbitrary replacement? Was my dedication actually weakness? My reliability a form of complacency that made me vulnerable to someone more aggressive and politically astute? The self-doubt wasn't just about that specific situation. It extended to fundamental beliefs about fairness, merit, and the value of experience that had guided my entire career. The practical aspects of job hunting revealed how narrow my professional identity had become. My resume looked impressive on paper: 8 years of increasing responsibility, excellent performance reviews, measurable contributions to business success, but I struggled to articulate my value in terms that didn't reference the specific context of Henderson's auto supply. My expertise was deep but specialized. My network was limited to one industry in one geographic area. My confidence was shattered by the realization that professional relationships I'd valued were apparently more fragile than I'd understood. Interview questions about why I'd left my previous position forced me to craft explanations that were truthful but not bitter, professional but not defensive. Each conversation reminded me that I was starting over in my 40s, competing against younger candidates who might be perceived as more adaptable, more technologically savvy, more aligned with contemporary business practices. The breakthrough came not through dramatic revelation, but through gradual acceptance that maybe being discarded was actually liberation from a situation that had stopped serving my growth. Sitting in my truck outside a potential employer's building before an interview, I realized that I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I hadn't considered what I'd gained: freedom from a workplace where my contributions were undervalued, distance from people who could discard 8 years of loyalty without genuine consideration, an opportunity to find an environment where experience was viewed as asset rather than liability. The anger and hurt were still there, but they were being joined by something else: curiosity about what kind of work situation might actually appreciate the qualities that had made me successful before Jessica arrived to redefine what success looked like. For the first time since leaving Henderson's, I walked into that interview not as someone desperate to replace what I'd lost, but as someone with valuable experience looking for the right opportunity to apply it. The silence was finally becoming space for new possibilities, rather than just emptiness where my old life used to be. The most important lesson I learned from my experience at Henderson's wasn't about workplace politics or protecting yourself from ambitious colleagues. It was about the fundamental importance of advocating for your own value before expecting others to recognize it. For 8 years, I had operated under the assumption that excellent work would speak for itself, that loyalty and competence would naturally be rewarded with security and respect. I'd been silent about my contributions, modest about my achievements, and naive about the reality that perception often matters more than performance in determining professional survival. The mistake wasn't trusting David or being caught off guard by Jessica's ambition. It was believing that I could remain invisible while being indispensable, that I could build my worth through quiet excellence rather than visible leadership. This realization forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about how I positioned myself not just at Henderson's, but throughout my entire career. The process of rebuilding my professional identity required honest examination of patterns I'd repeated for decades, without questioning their effectiveness. I'd always been the person who arrived early, stayed late, solved problems without fanfare, and avoided drawing attention to my contributions. This approach had made me valuable to employers, but it had also made me replaceable because my value wasn't clearly understood or publicly acknowledged. Jessica's success wasn't just about her relationship with David, it was about her ability to articulate her worth, to position herself as essential, to make her contributions visible and her potential obvious. While I'd been perfecting systems in the background, she'd been building a narrative about herself as the solution to problems I didn't even know existed. The learning wasn't that I should become more like Jessica, but that I needed to find ways to communicate my value that felt authentic while being strategically smart. The emotional work of moving beyond betrayal required separating legitimate hurt from self-defeating victimhood. Yes, I'd been treated unfairly by people I'd trusted, but continuing to define myself by that experience would only limit my future possibilities. The frustration and disappointment were valid feelings that deserved acknowledgement, but they couldn't become permanent residents in my psychological landscape. I had to learn the difference between processing what happened and being trapped by it, between learning from experience and being defined by it. This distinction became crucial when potential employers asked about my departure from Henderson's, when networking conversations touched on my work history, when I had to present myself as someone moving forward rather than someone stuck in past grievances. The emotional maturity required was significant, accepting responsibility for my part in what happened while not accepting blame for other people's choices. The practical application of these lessons began with small changes in how I approached professional relationships and opportunities. In job interviews, I started telling stories about my contributions rather than just listing responsibilities. I practiced articulating not just what I'd done, but the impact of what I'd done. The problems I'd solved, the value I'd created. I learned to ask questions about company culture, decision-making processes, and how success was measured and recognized. These weren't skills I'd needed at Henderson's because I'd assumed that workplace was permanent, but they were essential for navigating a world where job security came from adaptability rather than loyalty. The confidence required to advocate for myself felt uncomfortable initially, like bragging or being pushy, but I gradually understood that self-advocacy was a form of respect for both myself and potential employers who needed clear information to make good decisions. The most profound shift happened when I stopped viewing workplace relationships as personal friendships and started treating them as professional partnerships with clear expectations and boundaries. This didn't mean becoming cold or calculating, but it meant understanding that business decisions are made based on business criteria, not personal loyalty or emotional attachment. David's choice to replace me wasn't personal betrayal. It was a business decision that I'd failed to anticipate or influence because I'd misunderstood the nature of our relationship. This perspective helped me approach new work situations with appropriate emotional investment, building connections that were warm and collaborative without being dependent or naive. The goal became finding environments where my approach to work was valued, rather than trying to adapt my approach to fit environments that rewarded different qualities. The transformation from victim to strategist required developing new skills in workplace communication, relationship management, and personal branding that I'd never considered necessary. I learned to document my achievements, to speak up in meetings, to volunteer for visible projects, to build networks beyond my immediate workplace. These weren't manipulative tactics, but professional survival skills in a competitive environment, where being good at your job was just the entry requirement for consideration. I started reading about leadership, negotiation, and career development, not to become someone different, but to become a more effective version of myself. The irony was that developing these skills made me better at the technical aspects of my work, not worse, because understanding the broader context made me more strategic about where to focus my energy and expertise. The ultimate lesson was that professional success requires both competence and communication, both expertise and advocacy, both loyalty and strategic thinking. The qualities that had made me valuable at Henderson's: attention to detail, systematic thinking, customer focus, reliability were still assets, but they needed to be packaged and presented in ways that made their value obvious to people who might not understand their importance. I learned to tell the story of my work, not just do the work itself. I learned to build relationships that could survive changes in organizational structure or leadership priorities. Most importantly, I learned that protecting my professional future was my responsibility, not something I could delegate to supervisors who might have different priorities or competing loyalties. The betrayal at Henderson's had been painful, but it had also been educational, teaching me lessons about workplace reality that I might never have learned if I'd remained comfortable and secure in my old position. The silence I'd maintained about my own value had ultimately made me vulnerable to replacement by someone who understood that visibility and voice were as important as competence and commitment. Never again would I assume that good work would speak for itself. I would make sure it had a clear, confident voice that couldn't be ignored or underestimated.